Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister still say that vaccinating all Australians, including aged care residents and workers, is, to quote him, not a race?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for the question. The reference to not a race, Mr Speaker, was first said by the Secretary of the Department of Health, Mr Speaker. Professor Brendan Murphy,
on my left.
Secretary of the Department of Health and the Chair of the Scientific and Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, Mr Speaker, and I affirmed his remarks, Mr Speaker. And I affirmed his remarks. I affirm the remarks of the Secretary of Health, Mr Speaker, because all the way through this pandemic, one of the key factors that both our government and the governments around the country, and indeed governments in other countries, Mr Speaker, is we have always been mindful of the expert advice informing the decisions that we have taken, Mr Speaker. And that reference was made by the Secretary, Mr Speaker, and it was affirmed by me, Mr Speaker, in a way that was consistent in the way that I have always considered very carefully the advice provided by Professor Murphy. Now, Mr Speaker, if those opposite want to play politics with the advice provided by our medical experts, Mr Speaker, and seek to call into question the references made by the Secretary of Health
Prime Minister will just pause.
Chair of the
Prime Minister will pause for a second, just for memories. There might have been a weekend since our last question time, but my attitude has not abated. I need to be able to hear the questions and the answers. When those interjecting wildly do so, it makes it difficult for me to do that, and I'm not going to allow that to occur. Members will not interject or they will be ejected. The Prime Minister has the call.
So, Mr Speaker, I share the view of the Chair of the Scientific and Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, Professor Brendan Murphy, Mr Speaker. I share his view. The question for those opposite is why do they call into question the advice that is provided to the government, Mr Speaker?
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Prime Minister will resume his seat. Members on my right. The Minister for Education will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business.
On direct relevance, the question asks the Prime Minister whether he'll take responsibility for his own words, and that you can't just flick past that and try to say, reframe the question, oh, Labor's wanting to criticise someone else. He's the one who said it. The question asks him whether he'll take responsibility for it.
Will resume his seat. The Prime Minister, in answering the question, has been very relevant up until this point, and I call the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I do stand behind my words, Mr Speaker. I do stand by my words, Mr Speaker, and my words were based on the expert advice of the Chair of the Scientific and Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, Professor Brendan Murphy. But he wasn't alone, Mr Speaker, because Queensland Health is also quoted, Mr Speaker, on the 3rd of March of 2021, where it says that this is not a race. That is from Queensland Health, Mr Speaker, on their own Twitter feed, Mr Speaker. So it is the medical advice, Mr Speaker, in using that terminology at that time, Mr Speaker. I listened to the medical advice, Mr Speaker. Those opposite may want to call into question the advice provided by our medical experts, such as Professor Murphy, Mr Speaker, but I certainly will not, and they cannot run away from the imputation they have put in this place right here and now, calling into question the judgment of Professor Murphy.
The Leader of the Opposition seeking to table the document.
I am, Mr Speaker. A document with quotes from the 11th of March interview with Today Show by the Prime Minister saying it's not a race. From the 14th of March, doorstop in Castle Hill from the Prime Minister saying it's not a race. And the 31st of March 2021 press conference Raytheon Australia in Adelaide saying, and so it's not a race.
Is leave granted, the Prime Minister?
And Mr Speaker, you can table that.
Yeah.
Mr Speaker, and I will table from the 10th of March, Mr Speaker, the comments of Professor Murphy, the day before those comments were made, Mr
Members
Speaker,
on both sides.
Chair of the Scientific and Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, Mr Speaker, saying this is not a race. So, Mr Speaker, I affirm again, in addition to my earlier answer, in adding to my remarks, Mr Speaker, that the position taken by the government and by me as Prime Minister
No,
is
the Prime
informed
Minister,
by Professor
the Prime Minister
Brendan
needs
Murphy.
to just table the document.